Now we don't really know, because the artist is this. We're seeing the artist's perception. These were absolutely stunning people. They were tattooed. The men, their hair was very long. The men wore their hair in a bun. You know what it was used for? This is so incredible. A quiver. As a quiver for their arrows. Pretty adaptable, right? And they were, when you look at his drawings, they were very handsome people, the men and the women. Now they were very fascinated by the Tamukians. They had a very advanced culture. They had cities. The closest city to here was in what is now Tomoka Park, which is a mangled use of the reference to Tamukians. It became Tomoka somewhere down the line. I think the name of that town was Rakoka. Okay, now they were fairly advanced. They had very well adapted to the environment, the local environment. I want to tell you how they caught fish. I haven't been able to do it. I would love to do it. It's a lot better. Well, I don't know if it's as much fun as throwing a line out. But what they would do is they would work the tides, and they had nets. And before the tide went out, they would get into these tidal creeks, run the net across the mouth, and let the tide run out. And guess what's left? All the fish. So they were very, very good at mastering this environment. But what they didn't have were immunities to the diseases that the Europeans brought. By the end of the 1600s, virtually all of the Tamukians were gone. They had died. There were some that still continued to live. But that culture, by within 100 years, was wiped out. Now come the British. The mindset of a Brit is different than the mindset of somebody from Basque or some other part of Spain. They wanted commercial exploitation of Florida, not settlement, not convert to Christianity and Roman Catholicism. They were interested in the dollar. So the British got the Hammock and other in 1763. And they were into the plantation economy. We grew rice, and one of the major crops that this area produced was indigo, which creates the purple dye, that was highly, and it's a terrible process to make indigo. I'm not even going to explain it. If you want to know, you can come ask me. and they would sell it to Europe, and it commanded a lot of money. It made a lot of money for the colonies. Now, the very specific thing that arose out of that colonization of Florida was that there was a Scot. His name was Andrew Turnbull, Dr. Andrew Turnbull. And he came up with an idea that if he got a big hunk of land, he'd get indentured servants, he'd create an extremely profitable enterprise, and he had a lot of investors, and that's New Smyrna. You all know New Smyrna. New Smyrna, his wife was Greek. That's why it's called New Smyrna. Now, New Smyrna was the largest attempt at colonization of the United States of America ever in its history. It was 3 times the size of the attempt by the British to colonize Jamestown. Now, when he wanted to try to find the people that would come, he went to Minorca, the Greek Isles, and he said, you come with me, you work for me, in 7 years you'll have your own piece of land. He was oversubscribed. He had 1,400 people sign up. These were good people. This isn't like, okay, go to the prisons and, okay, how many of you want to go try to make a new life? No, these were good people. Now, just think about how hard a time they must have had in their native land to want to come here to a foreign land that was so far away they could never go back, and not knowing anything about what this place was. Those folks that came in that voyage created today the vibrancy of St. Augustine. I'm going to tell you how and why. Okay, those folks came, they worked very hard. Indigo, rice, they were treated very harshly. They didn't have enough supplies because more people came than expected. So the supply ships came first, the people came second, and the supplies weren't enough for everybody. Times were really hard. Turnbull used overseers. Turnbull was a Scot. The governor in St. Augustine was English. You all know English and Scot? They don't like each other. Not as bad as Spain and France. But they don't like each other. So there was this criticism about how terrible, and giving him a hard time. And the Menorcans decided, we want out. So they voted, and a kid, of course by then, at that age, obviously manhood, an 18-year-old lad named Francisco Pellicer. Pellicer Creek, Francisco Pellicer, walked from New Smyrna to St. Augustine by himself to petition the governor. Imagine a young man thinking that he could even do this. I'm not talking about the walk, about talking to somebody of extreme rank and to explain to him that things are really bad. And the governor granted to him the right for all of them to leave and to come, and they would be under the protection of the British. So he goes back and he brings them all, walking up the Old King's Road into St. Augustine. And these were the folks that gave life to really not much of a town then. Menorcan clam chowder, daddle pepper, that's all from the Menorcan tradition. Now, what's come out of that Menorcan tradition that affects Flagler County? Joseph Hernandez at Bing's, Florida's first voice in the United States Congress. His father, Martin Hernandez, who, by the way, used to own Favorite Dyke State Park. Of course, it wasn't called Favorite Dyke State Park at the time. It was a grant from the King of Spain. Martin Hernandez was the chief carpenter of the fort, the Castillo in St. Augustine. Francisco Pellicer, you know what he used to own? Princess Place. That was a grant. Who's not been to Princess Place? Who's not? Just say, if you haven't been, you must go there. The Princess Place is truly a place of enchantment, and it's this way across the river. So these folks formed the core of the Hammock at that time. The plantations were very successful. Just so you know, where we're standing here, Sea Island cotton. Up that way, oranges. Down that way, cattle. They were this way, over by the Publix and Palm Harbor, sugarcane. He had the best rum in the territory. And they were very wealthy because the resources that were grown here were Sea Island cotton. That was shipped to the markets in Georgia. The long staple cotton, very prized. So it commanded a lot of money. Now, what other influence? I want to talk about the Seminole Indians, and this is the time frame I want to close. You all know the Seminoles have a huge influence here. And of course, there were a number of Seminole Indian wars and whatnot. And I want to tell you that the relationship between those that planted here and lived here and made a living here, that one might view as the colonists, whether they were Menorcan or whatever, and the Seminoles, was fairly good. It was a relationship of trade, because you know who owned the cattle? Most of the cattle? You know who the cattle barons were in the 1600s, the 1700s, and the early 1800s? The Native Americans. They were the cattle barons. They sold the cattle back to the Spanish. The Spanish brought them by boat. They got free. They went out. They multiplied in this environment. And it was the Native Americans that herded them up and sold them back to the Spanish when they were needed. Now, the plantation owners here, they had their own cattle. In fact, there's an island off of marine land. It actually, it's called, we bought it through a land acquisition to preserve it. It's called, today named Hernandez Island. That's where the cattle were penned. They penned the cattle on the island, a natural pen for the cattle. So, what went wrong? Federal government interference. Every time you take something out of local control and put it in the hands of idiots, it's going to go wrong. Now, the people from Georgia and the Carolinas did not like Florida because Florida was the destination of slaves escaping. Y'all heard about the Underground Railroad that went north? The first Underground Railroad went south, came to Florida. And slaves would flee into Florida. And Florida had a relatively benign attitude, relatively speaking, a relatively benign attitude. There was a free African fort in Pensacola area. There was a free African town north of St. Augustine. Africans lived with Native Americans, but Native Americans, the Seminoles, also had African slaves. I've never quite understood that, but there was a wide diversity in the way people lived that was relatively benign. So think of the Georgians and the Carolinians resenting Florida, agitating to the United States of America, you've got to do something about this, and they found a champion. And their champion was Andrew Jackson.